And recording B.
Okay. We are here in the library of the Columbus, Mississippi home of Ben C. Toledano and Margot Toledano. We're talking to Ben C. Toledano, who's the image you can see. Once again, it's part of the Loyola Oral History Project, focusing primarily on New Orleans in the 1970s. I'm Jack Davis, asking some questions, and Justin Nystrom, professor at the Loyola History Loyola History Department, behind the cameras and asking probably some other questions. So Ben C., thanks for having us up here. Glad to be with you. You are a New Orleanian whose family and roots go back centuries. You're a lifelong New Orleanian, and in the 1970s you are as deeply involved as anybody I can think of in New Orleans affairs, being a partner in a law firm, raising 4 kids, starting businesses, owning an Italian restaurant, saving historic buildings, active in reform and politics, running for mayor, running for the United States Senate. What drove that breadth and depth of commitment to New Orleans on your part?
Well, Jack, I really can't say that it was due to this deep feeling of commitment to New Orleans. You often have to wonder how much is personal, how much of the motivation is activated by personal considerations other than wanting to do something for your community. It's simple enough to talk about caring about your community, but the more I think about it, the more I wonder why certain things were done, why I got involved in certain things. And I can't really say that, I can't be altruistic about it and say that I did these things because it was for my city. That had to be an element of it, but I can't.
Well, you don't have to say that. You just, why, for instance, did you run for mayor in 1970?
Well, I think there were a lot of factors. One was that I think I was bored with what I was doing for a living.
Which was?
Defending insurance companies in tort actions, trying cases almost every day. And it wasn't very intellectually stimulating. It was a nice way to try to support my family, but somehow or other I wanted to, I guess like a lot of people, I wanted to feel that my existence mattered. That's such a subjective thing that it's hard to really explain. But I don't think it's unusual for people to want to be recognized, and these are neither good nor bad things, just the way it is.
Well, in New Orleans in 1969, when the mayor's race started, in 1970, when it finished with the general election, had been this followed a decade or more of really important major changes in the city's economic and political landscape, and there was a huge crowd of people running for mayor in 1970. How did you distinguish yourself from those dozen or so other candidates?
Well, I guess if I had to give one example, it would be a presentation up at that Catholic girls' school on, Claven and State Street in the auditorium there. The League of Women Voters and the Junior League, I think, were co-sponsoring a meeting of all the candidates, and there must have been 8 Democrats, I would imagine. And I was included, being the only Republican and the Republican nominee in the general election. And one of the questions was, what do you think of the manner in which Jim Garrison has prosecuted or persecuted, both perhaps, Clay Shaw in trying to involve Clay in the death of President Kennedy? And to a man, the Democrats, who certainly cared about Jim Garrison's political clout, gave the usual, oh, Jim is a very bright, capable guy. He's a little irascible. He's difficult to deal with sometimes, but nobody would really take the gloves off. And when it got to me, I said, I think what Garrison's done is a disgrace. I think he should be replaced in public office. I don't think there's any excuse for what he's done, and was very strong about it. That's the only standing ovation I got from that so-called liberal group, primarily. I mean, the crowd there.
And how much then media notice did that get?
I would think 0, usual amount. The other major story, I guess.
If I can ask you though, this was in 1969, after Garrison had failed to convict Clay Shaw. Am I right on that? Or
probably so, Jack. You're better on dates than I am.
So and Garrison would be in office until 1973.
Well, he was.
So he was still. So the other candidates were still
wanted his support,
right?
Which was strong. And didn't want to offend him, in other words.
So even after that fiasco of a trial, he still had what they feared as political reform.
That's the way I saw it.
Yeah.
I can't imagine any other way. Because I'm sure they couldn't have felt that way in their, deep down.
Right. You mentioned the second.
Well, yeah. Speaking of the press, one day I was speaking to the Sertoma Club across the street from the Supreme Court building there, that side street, and both newspapers were there and 3 television stations were there. It was well covered, and I had used that occasion to call upon the community leaders and social leaders to show us that they believed what they were saying, and to resign from all clubs and organizations to which they belong, which systematically excluded people because of nationality or race and so forth. Because the big issue in the campaign was the Public Accommodations Ordinance, which was to racially integrate the neighborhood bars and restaurants in New Orleans.
And this had that ordinance had been passed just before the election. One of the leaders of it was Moon Landrieu, against whom you were running in the general election, one-on-one. And was this during the general election that you talked to the Sertoma Club?
I think it was.
Uh-huh. And the Public Accommodations Act was a major issue in that.
I think so.
Campaign. And so what response did you get to that?
Well, I called on these people by name. I said that Harry Kelleher and Owen Fenner and Dick Freeman and all of the social bigwigs should lead the way, that they wanted the poor working class people to show their good faith by supporting the Public Accommodations Ordinance, and that the neighborhood bars and restaurants were the clubs of the working men, where they went to drink beer after work and be with their buddies and do whatever they did together, talk, play pool, whatever. And that I thought that these outstanding citizens should lead the way and set examples for the lesser fortunate people. Well, after I said it, I thought, well, I've really done it today. This is the end of me, but I'm glad I did it because I felt so strongly about it. So when I took the bus home that day, I thought about it and wondered what the ramifications were going to be. And when it came time to listen to the news, I did, and there was no mention of it. And then when I read the papers the next day, there was no mention of it. And in my judgment, without knowing, I would say that the boys in charge of things just killed it. They just decided we don't want this, and it was as if it didn't happen. It was the most extraordinary experience that this was a big thing. I remember there was a Jewish lawyer named Herbert Garon, Garon, who was there at the meeting, and he looked on me as a segregationist, as a right-winger or whatever, and he came up to me with tears in his eyes afterwards and said, I never thought I'd live long enough to hear someone say this, and thank you. And so that made an impression on me. But
the public accommodations ordinance did make a race of it in the general election.
Absolutely.
In the spring of 1970. A lot of the way it gets spun is that it's a pro-integration ordinance that Moon Landrieu and members of the city council passed, and the way the opposition is spun is as opposed to that degree of integration. And what you're saying you did here was turn that around and challenge the people who were seeking more widespread public accommodations by making them accommodate everyone in their own organizations and clubs.
Well, that was the idea. Of course, I knew they wouldn't, but the thing about it was nobody really wanted to integrate either the black or the white neighborhood bars and restaurants, because that was the social life of the poorer working class people. It's where they went to be with their friends, and that they didn't have the clubs to go to. Those were their clubs. And of course, Father Screen, Pat Screen's brother, I guess, I don't know, sort of led the fight for Moon. And once I accused Moon publicly of hiding under Father Screen's skirt. and Moon thought that was going a little too far. I said, well, you've seen the way he dresses. But it was so typical of the mentality in New Orleans. I mean, the leaders were trying to sell it on the basis of, well, if we're going to attract major athletic events and bring tourists to the city, we're going to have to be an open city. However, the important thing was that the Civil Rights Act of 64, I guess it was, the one that the LBJ, one of the ones that he brought about, specifically excluded neighborhood bars because they knew that that was not a good place to try to do social experimentation. Right. So the feds had excluded it, but in New Orleans, our cherished leaders were going to impose this to make New Orleans look like the open city, we don't discriminate, and so forth. And I, to this day, I resent anybody taking a position that they would not apply to themselves and their own families. Here were these guys going to clubs, ordering people like Alden McDonald's father to get them drinks.
Alden McDonald being the first president of the first black
Liberty
bank,
Bank or
Liberty
whatever
Bank.
it was.
Yes. You're talking about his father.
His father, who worked at the Boston Club. They would fetch drinks for the bigwigs, but the poor man deserved no consideration. So I was very sincere about that, and I think that Moon could probably see the merit of it, because he was never an elitist as far as I was concerned. I think he cared more for the average working man than he did for the big shots. But the die was cast. We were going into a transitional period that could not be avoided. I mean, it was, the 70s were the period of transition.
Transition from what to what?
Well, the public accommodation, I mean, the whole concept of public accommodations, which I agree with generally. In other words, I don't think that anyone can make a reasonable or proper argument for excluding black people from any public services or activities or benefits. And yet people, because of the education question, it became something different than what it was. In other words, the first thing we had to do was make all public opportunities available to everyone equally. That was the big thing. But then the education situation, which I think was a different question, became the ultimate question, the only thing. And people lost sight of, this, well, who cared whether black people had lunch at Woolworths or that sort of thing. That was a symbolic involvement initially, and it was effective. But once the ball got rolling, there again, the poor working class people had no spokesman that they needed, and emotions got the best of everybody. Confused also by the Supreme Court in 1954. That was one of the most poorly handled decisions ever, I think. Because
the Brown versus Board.
Yes, all deliberate speed. In other words, they gave up their responsibility and said with all deliberate speed, without saying what that was, and are we to integrate the seniors at high school immediately, even though it may not be in anyone's interest to do so. And then for, several decades, we had endless litigation over that.
And in the decade of the 1960s, in particular in New Orleans, was when battles were fought over integration and resisting integration in the legislature and the local level. Were you still able to, and by the time 1970 came around, the white flight had started going pretty speedily, and the schools were becoming not integrated at all, in the reverse of what the Supreme Court had in mind. Was that an issue in the mayor's race?
Remember, the people that were leaving were not the uptown crowd, not the big shots, not the socialites. They weren't leaving at all. because during the 60s, as best I recall it, when things were going on all over the country, we felt immune. We would read about someone in St. Bernard, being irate over integration or that sort of thing. But we didn't think of it as a problem for us because most all of our kids went to private schools. And it just didn't touch us the same way. Plus the fact that New Orleans always took an extra decade or so to do what any other place did. And so I would say, I'm trying to think if and when the integration issue ever became a problem for the uptown socialites. And frankly, it's hard for me to think of when that may have happened. I mean, not that the people didn't have opinions, not that if you were with Darwin Fenner privately, he wouldn't express himself or that kind of thing. But we never really felt that it touched us, so that most people didn't feel they had anything at stake, any reason to take and then they would be delighted when Judge Perez would be excommunicated, or when Jack Rico would be excommunicated, and over things like that.
When you refer to us, you're including yourself in this group of uptown residents or people from an uptown culture. Can you explain how you got there? How did you get to be part of that group, and how did you differentiate yourself?
Well, my father came from a distinguished old family that went back before the founding, really, of New Orleans in 1718, and so he was well recognized, although it had been a long time since anybody had done anything in the family other than, take pride in the name. And then my mother, who came from an entirely different background, her mother was a non-practicing Jew from Clinton, Louisiana, whose family came over in 1848 when all of the revolutions were going on in Europe, and her family came from Paris and from Alsace-Lorraine. Then my grandfather, Mr. Casanis, who founded Merchant's Coffee Company, we don't really know anything about him, except that he was a lovely, wonderful gentleman, and everyone adored him. So as a result of that, my mother was made Queen of the Mardi Gras in 1929, I think it was.
That's a pretty uptown.
I would say
thing.
They like to make it look like Comus is the big thing, but Queen of Mardi Gras is the big thing. I mean, that's the one that really carries the... So I was the child of an aristocratic, fallen on bad times father, and a mother of, very new circumstances, who just happened to have the most wonderful father in the world. And I would imagine that he didn't join the clubs and so forth because he didn't want to embarrass my grandmother, because Jews were not included, and I don't think he would have ever put her in embarrassing. But the captain of Rex selected his daughter to be Queen of Mardi Gras. So because of those two things, my name and my mother's prominence, we lived up there. My grandfather had made a good bit of money.
Where did you live when you were growing up?
1321 Pine Street. And that was really great because it was half a block from Luscious School. And Luscious School was where all of the children of the professors at Tulane and Newcomb went to school. And of course it was all white in those days. We had wonderful teachers. So we could just walk 3 or 4 houses and be at one of the best public schools in New Orleans. It was terrific. And that's where we... And my grandparents lived at 630 Burdett Street, one house off of St. Charles Avenue. They built a house there, and I don't know when, but...
When did you start feeling that, looking around you, something wasn't right, that there was inequality, there was exclusion perhaps? When did you start noticing or experiencing that?
Well, you know, it's hard to put a date on it. I would say by nature I'm a malcontent. And even when I was in high school, I was very critical internally of the guys that drank a lot and gambled and, you know, seemed to feel that the rules didn't apply to them. I never did like that. And that's why, except that over a period of time you learn to live with yourself and with others, that once I got accustomed to being called a racist, it didn't matter at all. I didn't care because here I am on one hand caring about the less fortunate, regardless of color. And on the other hand, you see, labels were the order of the day.
Why would you be called a racist? Is it because you were from a racist society, a racist city, or?
No, I would say that I was definitely opposed to the immediate integration of the public schools on every level and every grade. I and some others felt that it should be like kindergarten the first year, then add a grade each year so that the children could develop together. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that in that sense I was a segregationist. And the thing we feared has come about. In other words, we, in my judgment only, we have destroyed the public education system in the Deep South. And I mean, look what happened in New Orleans. My God. Look what the Jeffersons did to the public schools.
Well, describe that.
Well, they saw... I have to watch my language as to how they saw things, but it was an opportunity to clean house, to steal, to make contracts with relatives and friends, to not care at all about the children, to not demand proper teaching qualifications, to put cronies in as superintendents and whatever. It was, they didn't mind destroying education to feather their own nests. And I look back on it now at when Mrs. Charles Keller got me and the boy who's head of the law school at LSU, real nice guy.
Jack Weiss?
Jack Weiss. Jack Weiss and I were the white campaign leaders for Bill Jefferson when he first ran for mayor. Mrs. Keller called us and said there was this wonderful young man that she, you know, and she was such a dear person. and she thought the world of him, and he'd been to Harvard Law School, and would Jack and I help him. So we started having regular meetings at Jack's house to assist him in running for mayor. I haven't talked to Jack since then, to tell you the truth, but that was a funny situation. But it's a fact.
That was in early 1990s, late 1980s. I'm foggy on when Bill.
No, because I left in '83.
Yeah, okay.
No, so it was the first time he ran, and it was against Dutch.
Against Dutch Morial, okay.
Yeah.
In Dutch Morial's second election.
Yeah, I guess so. And
but while the 1960s in New Orleans was often experienced by people the kind of exclusion that people were focusing on, mostly in New Orleans in the 1960s, had to do with race.
with what?
Exclusion had to do with race and exclusion of blacks from government and economics and organizations. But you were starting to focus on different kinds of exclusion of everybody by the uptown. There was an uptown exclusivity that was keeping out not only blacks, but Jews and Italians and women and
Hispanics
and Texans.
Right.
So and people who were coming here to help grow the economy. How did you, was that a view that you had difficulty getting across as everybody else was focusing on race?
Yeah, I don't think I got it across at all, as a matter of fact. I think it's to the credit of my acquaintances or friends, if you will, that they tolerated my attitudes because they were so different. I never, ever thought that blacks should be excluded from public office or business or anything of that nature. Education, I must say that I make an exception in that instance. But, and I'm very sad that I think that events have proven me correct in that regard. I look at what's happened locally to the school system, and then the white kids go to the white Christian academies and the same old, and so you have segregation again, except worse than it was because you don't have the qualified teachers and superintendents that you used to have. That's what's so sad. And no, I don't think I was ever able to. I never really tried. I remember once I gave a speech up at Tulane Law School during the general election for mayor, and I didn't realize they had been prone to support me. And Edmund McElhenney Jr. was in the class, and after he heard my pitch about the leaders of the community.
Explain who he is.
Well, they were probably the most prominent family in Louisiana. They owned Avery Island, and they made Tabasco, and the island was a Spanish land grant that the family had gotten, and they had a lot of oil and gas. They were rich people and very prominent socially. And when I gave my pitch about the way New Orleans worked, he got up and he was irate. He said, I was going to vote for you, but I'm not going to do it now because I didn't realize you weren't on our side, or something to that effect. And, I didn't know him. I mean, he introduced himself, but so I would say I got exactly nowhere.
Do you think he voted?
I did get Walker Percy to resign from the Boston Club. That is one of my accomplishments.
And when was that? When did he resign?
I'd have to check to see when Walker resigned, but we were having lunch, and I said, "You know, you're a phony bastard." I said, "You're always talking about meritocracy and equal opportunity and all of that." And I said, "Here, you and all your family belong to the Boston Club, and they exclude blacks and Italians and blah, 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 Jews." And typical Walker fashion, he didn't say anything. And then later, some friend of mine said, he said, "I saw where your friend Walker Percy resigned from the Boston Club." And I said, "No." And said, "Yeah." We never discussed it. I never said a word to him. I never told him that I knew about it or anything. But I figured that was my single accomplishment.
Now, did that have any legs? Did they influence anybody else?
I'm sure not.
Yeah. I mean, the 1970s for Walker Percy was a big time. You know, I think he published 4 novels from 1971 to 1980, and he was becoming increasingly visible. Would that have?
Oh, they didn't know who he was. I mean, come on. No, I mean, I'm sure that on those few occasions when he'd have lunch with Dick Faust and Rivers Long and a few others, someone would say, "Who is that guy?" "I think he writes books. I don't know." They wouldn't have known who Walker was.
So they didn't read these novels about Louisiana and New Orleans and the culture, The Last Gentleman or Lancelot.
Well, I think Dick Faust did. I'm sure Rhoda got him to do it. But
his daughter Rhoda Faust, who founded the Maple Street bookstore.
And but no, Walker didn't have any. He didn't carry any weight at all.
Does that say something about the culture then? That here's a nationally prominent novelist who's writing novels set in New Orleans and it's largely unknown?
I would say that the group of people about whom we're speaking are so, or have been historically, so self-satisfied with their lot in life, with their position. And one thing that very few people ever seem to understand who've never been a part of it is the Mardi Gras. And I'm constantly amazed by people on the outside who tell me it's just a good time. It's a time to celebrate, drink, to dance, to, it's nothing other than a good time. Well, it's a lot more than a good time. And if they only knew the extent to which, and plus the fact that men control the social life in New Orleans. Now you ask yourself, what other communities do the men decide on costumes? And we used to have to wear these damn dresses and wigs. I mean, we were like transvestites.
Where did you wear those?
At the balls.
And you went to the balls?
Well,
as a kid?
No, I did for a while because of my father, because he was active in those things. But finally, I just gave it up. I couldn't do it anymore.
And yet, in this is a period of time, 1970s, when Mardi Gras was growing in terms of the size of the spectacle of the existing parades and the number of beads and the number of new organizations that were parading and the attention that was paid to it in the national media and local media. I mean, how do you reconcile that growth with the effect you're seeing?
Right.
Or not reconcile?
I think the reconciliation you have to come about with is this. I think in many ways it's stronger now than it used to be when Momus and Comus and would ride, because I think by becoming less public, it has become more private, and I think that Mardi Gras is alive and well now, and I see the young men who are running it, and I know how they feel about it. They don't have to share it now. In the old days, you know, the noblesse oblige concept, we do this for the peasants. We throw them doubloons or beads, trinkets or whatever it is. And but now they're not troubled with that, and no one falls off the float drunk and hits their head like several of our friends did. And so I think anyone that thinks that Mardi Gras is fading out is kidding themselves.
Well, it's probably actually, and it certainly was getting bigger in the 1970s.
Publicly, yeah, but remember that, what's his name, the float builder?
Blaine Kern?
Blaine Kern, the commercial aspect became so great with Bacchus and the others that there was a tremendous, the old crews used to take the old floats and redo them, and then Kern made it into a multi-million-dollar business, and but it was horrible, I thought. I mean, God, you'd go and you'd have these colored men, you know, like butlers, dress you and put on your golden dress. And,
you mean when you were going into
your
the
blonde
den,
wig?
You were going into the cruise den to be dressed, to be on a
be
parade.
dressed.
You would have butlers.
Yeah.
And it was strictly a matter of racial segregation.
Well, I don't think that even
separation.
I don't think that even came up. I mean, you don't think about things that are not supposed to be, unless they are, and so they weren't.
There were complaints in the 1970s that the traditional Mardi Gras organizations and the social clubs that were behind them excluded newcomers to the city who were, many of whom were coming in because of the oil business or possibly the port business, which hadn't declined at that stage. The oil industry was growing. Was that a factor, do you think?
Well, I think that by and large, the outsiders, even if they had a lot of money, will look down on by at least a handful. It doesn't take a lot of people to ball a guy from a club.
To blackball?
Yeah, to blackball a guy. And there were always a few of the unsuccessful socialites who wanted to keep out newcomers. They're nouveau riche. They're not like we are. And there was a little nucleus that could always make that happen. And on one hand, you had the lawyers who did their legal work, hustling and scrambling to get them in, because it's gotten to where the Boston Club is lawyers and country doctors. Virtually any country doctor can join because you pay the dues and you never use the facilities. Yeah. So it's a good deal.
Depending on your background. You have to have the right background.
Well, not necessarily, because you marry a debutante. You come from, Deep River, Mississippi, and you marry a queen of one of the balls, and you're automatically included. You're a son-in-law, and so it doesn't matter. There's every Thursday there are 4 guys, doctors, that have lunch together at the Boston Club, and
still do.
And let's see, still do, and I'm trying to remember. Not one of the 4 is from New Orleans, but they all married New Orleans debutantes, and they all got in because they were sons-in-law. And one of them is divorced from his daughter, but once you get in, you're in. And so that's the thing to do, is marry a debutante, get in the clubs, and then get divorced. It's a nice system.
Yeah. So if you're coming in from outside New Orleans to head up a exploration office for a major oil company or to start a new bank that would rival the Whitney Bank, do you have trouble getting into these clubs in the 1970s?
I would think so. I'm sure that.
And the impact of that on the New Orleans economy, is it
I think
measurable, or is it?
I think there's a definite impact in the sense that it discourages businesses from moving into the community. And the thing is, New Orleans had an opportunity to be the oil and gas capital. And Houston took it by default because Mr. Berry, people at the Whitney and the old timers, they didn't want any of those questionable loans, where you lend the money to drill the new field. And so that's what created the multi-billion-dollar banks in Texas. In Houston was the fact that they couldn't get the money in New Orleans. So then gradually, Houston became the oil and gas capital, and New Orleans was just satellite offices, more and more so. And if they don't feel welcome, if you don't open your arms and say, hey, look, but if you say, I found out that guy and his wife lived in a trailer out in Oklahoma when they were laying a pipeline for his oil company, living in a trailer, and now they come here and put him in a suit and want him to be like we are, and so.
Did anybody worry about the impact this would have? I mean, it seemed that during the 1970s, you have this Poydras Street corridor, which is raising new skyscrapers for oil companies, Shell and Amoco and Texaco, I think. Was there any concern that New Orleans exclusionary practices could slow that down?
Well, I'm sure there always is with the lawyers, because wherever there's representation involved, I mean, they'll do everything but kill. They'll break every commandment but that to get business. And so they want the business. But I would say, and I guess insurance, and certain businesses wanted that, but the social elite didn't want that. They would always talk about, we don't want to be another Atlanta or another Houston. To hell with them. We're going to stay what we are and be proud of our heritage. And they would cite those cities as examples of what can happen if you're not careful. And in the process, they lost, all of this. After World War II, New Orleans was the Queen City of the South, and it could have gone anywhere they wanted. I mean, it could really have been something.
Yeah. What were the notable assets then after World War II? We had a port and an airport.
Well,
we had relations with Latin America.
Well, think what it could have been. In other words, it's the last port of call before you go into the Gulf, so that all of your grain for export had to come through New Orleans, and all of your produce from Central America would come up to New Orleans. I can remember every politician that wasn't talking about race was talking about the gateway to the Americas. I mean, even when Chap Morrison was flying around Central America with Zsa Zsa Gabor, it was always gateway to the Americas. Boy, we're gonna open up the whole thing. And then Houston has to dig a port, and they're beating the devil out of New Orleans, and the Bananas go to Gulfport now. They left New Orleans.
What happened to the port? I mean, we haven't really gotten deeply into the oil industry, but what happened to the port? Why did that?
I would think the same thing had happened to everything else in New Orleans. Wonderful management, great leadership, all of the things that make for good. They probably had more luncheons to give, little awards, maybe a little silo or something of corn or soybeans to someone who was the employee of the week, while the other people were working there.
Well, I'm not sure the transcriber of this recording will recognize that you were being sarcastic when you were talking about the great management.
Well, I think that if they can't analyze the leadership and management, business management of the city, I wouldn't say political, because I think, by and large, I think Moon did a remarkable job considering what he had to work with. And I hear that Mitch is doing a good job, but tourism is the only thing now, and so you can concentrate on that one thing. And
Can we talk? Let me take us back to where we started on the election.
We're running on an hour. Do you want to take a break?
Do you want to stop and take a break now, or keep
he
rolling?
wants to. He says.
No, I'm good. I
That's
just
good.
wanted to know if we've gone 50 minutes, and I just didn't know if you needed a break or anything.
Okay, well, I'll see if my legs are working.
Okay.
You want to take a little walk around?
No, I just stand up.
I'm gonna pause this.
If I walk, my legs go to sleep.
Back to we started talking about 1972 in the 1970 rather, the mayor's election. Who voted for Moon Landrieu in that two-person race, and who voted for you?
Well, let's see. Moon got 99% of the black vote. I think there was 1% mistakes, made, and I got 65% of the white vote.
And what would that say? What happened to Edmund McElhaney Jr.? Is he in the ones who didn't vote for you, or is he in the ones?
I don't know what he did.
Yeah.
I don't know what he did.
And Moon Landrieu had defeated in a Democratic primary
Jimmy Fitz.
Jimmy Fitzmaurice, who later became lieutenant governor. Was the split similar in terms of the demographics of New Orleans? Did you get the Fitzmaurice vote?
I got an awful lot of it, and Fitzmaurice had gotten, I think, more white votes than Moon had, but Fitzmaurice, in typical Fitzmaurice, in his way, he said afterwards, I don't understand these votes. He said, the black man has never had a better friend than Jimmy Fitzmaurice. Now, whatever that meant, I don't know. Because, number one, he was not telling the truth, let's put it that way. And they had better friends. And Jimmy had done everything he could to organize the white vote.
Who were the better friends that they had in the 1960s than Jimmy Fitzmaurice?
Well, Moon for sure, and I would say almost anybody. I never thought of Jimmy as a friend of. He was everyone's friend. I mean, maybe if that makes you a friend, he'd shake your hand. How you doing, partner? Glad to see you. You're looking good. I like your tie. I mean, if that's friendship, okay. He was good at that, but.
Was this the decade leading up to the mayor's race in 1970? Was this when New Orleans was beginning to calculate the vote in terms of racial breakdowns? I mean, it just didn't happen before? Were there people who got it quicker than others, or am I just projecting backwards in an incorrect way?
Well, of course.
Did you figure on a black vote in that election that was?
I figured I wouldn't get any.
And did you think it was going to be as decisive as it was?
Well,
because in previous mayoral elections, it hadn't been as decisive.
No, even Vic Schiro got some black votes. And Vic shouldn't have probably. But I don't know when, of course, I would think without knowing that more blacks voted in Moon's race for mayor than had ever voted before, because they had never had a black candidate, but they had never had a friend, as good a friend as Moon, running. Mm-hmm. And so I would think, I mean, they got him out.
And registration was more possible, and the Civil Rights,
it was then the largest vote, you told me, I believe, ever recorded in a mayor's race.
I read recently that the general election was the biggest general election that New Orleans had, although I'm not certain that's in voter percentage or numbers.
Well, a lot of white people felt that it was the last chance for the whites to be in charge and control. And I was the beneficiary of that, because they were upset that Jimmy Fitzmaurice had lost. And
were you comfortable with that?
Sure. Damn right. You go wherever the votes. Well, I didn't have to compromise myself. When I would go into some of those neighborhood bars, they'd strike up singing "Bye Bye Blackbird." I wasn't going to say, "Hey guys, I find that song offensive. Don't sing it, please." That's ridiculous. No, Moon was doing all he could to get the black vote. I was doing what I could to get the white vote. It was just that simple. But I remember Nils Douglas and Bobby Collins and Lola Seeley and some of that crowd invited me over to Nils Douglas's office. This was during the campaign for the general election.
These were new black leaders who were supporting Moon.
Yeah, and very effective people. And Sherman Copeland. And so I went over there, and Nils had this wonderful bar that he opened up. It looked like a piece of furniture, and then the next thing you knew, it was open with every expensive call brand you could imagine in there. So Feldman was with me, and
this is Marty Feldman, now a federal judge.
Marty Feldman, the comedian, and so they said, "Look, we wanted you over here to tell you that we've got nothing against you. You're not going to get any of our votes, but it's nothing personal. It's business, that sort of thing. Sounded like the black mafia." We had drinks, and they said, someday we may be so powerful that we'll have to split up so that there'll be some Republican blacks as well as the majority Democrats. But that day hadn't come yet, and so we've still got to vote as one, and just wanted to make sure you understood. And I said, "Sure I do, of course I understand." And I said, "I've got no hard feelings. You guys have made your deals with Moon. You know what to expect, and he'll do what he tells you he's going to do. And that's all there is to it." And so they were very nice about it. And I knew I was going to get no black votes. Now, the day before the election, as I recall, Moon's people came out with a poll that showed that I was going to get 17% of the vote. And I got just beneath 42% of the vote. which was unheard of, which, I mean, unbelievable. Unbelievable.
What's the explanation for that discrepancy?
I don't think there was ever that discrepancy.
What was the discrepancy
To
between their
discourage-
numbers and the...
To discourage people from going to the polls.
Okay.
Say, what the hell? Why take the time when you can be drinking or playing tennis or something like that? I mean, the guy's going to get 17% of the vote.
Back to Nils Douglas's office.
Yeah.
What happened to all that Call brand liquor
Well, we drank some of it.
to seal the understanding?
Well, we stayed there and shot the breeze and talked about things.
And
Very
did you
friendly.
have continue to have good relations with those gentlemen?
Yeah, I did. I always thought Bobby Collins was sort of a crook, but I liked Nils, and I knew Sherman Copeland was a crook. And Don Hubbard was another one that was there. I thought Lola Eli was a nice guy. I didn't know him very well, but I always liked him. And there were a bunch of people there. I don't know.
And you had known Moon Landrew growing up,
Yeah,
in
we
boyhood.
lived in the same neighborhood.
You lived not far from his, although
Yeah.
his material context was a lot different from yours. I mean, he lived in a lower middle class white neighborhood, not far from bigger houses.
Yeah, well, I mean, our house wasn't that big, and it's a mistake to think that in those days people lived in a grand style, because they didn't. Because in those days, nice people didn't let on if they were comfortable. They went out of their way not to, because it was considered bad taste, bad form, poor manners, things that don't exist anymore. And so none of us had anything. I mean, hell, we hitchhiked to and from school. We had one boy in our class had a car, Rupert Richards, and that was it.
This was a class in what school?
At NOA, New Orleans Academy.
Uh-huh.
And those were the non-Jewish uptown boys, because it was sort of like the McGee's was for girls, NOA was for boys. That's the way it was. And everybody else went to Jesuit that you could, unless you went to Forte.
How well did you know Moon in that neighborhood? Did you know who he was? Did you?
Well, no one, in the sense you got to understand. You'd go out in the street or on the ground at the school, and there'd be a baseball game, and you'd have your glove and you'd play. I mean, we didn't exchange monogrammed cards or anything like that. I mean, if you had an opening in the outfield, you went and played. It was neighborhood stuff.
And after the election between you and Moon, you remained on friendly terms?
Well, he wouldn't speak to me for 2 years because they had tried to get me not to run. And they had made some offers to me of appointments to different boards or committees of my people if I didn't run. Because Moon was tired, and he didn't want another damn race. He really didn't.
Right.
And I understood that. I figured that was a plus for me. So he was angry that I had done so well. And so one day I saw him, a couple of years later, and I said, "Hey, by the way, I forgot to tell you, but you won the election and I lost." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you've been snubbing me and being angry with me, and you won." And at that time, there were 4 Republican congressmen coming on some subcommittee to New Orleans. to conduct a hearing of something, really to have a good time, except for Peter Frelinghuysen, who was a lovely gentleman, wonderful, wonderful man. And so I asked Moon if he would be a co-host for a luncheon at Antoine's for these people. And he said he would. And so we had an engraved invitation that said, Mayor Moon Landrieu and Ben C. Toledano invite you to attend. And he invited half of his friends. I invited half of my friends. And the 4 congressmen. And that was it. And I think, I told him, I said, let's just get on with it, and I mean, so.
What was your impact? What was your sense of what was happening in the Landrieu administration? The thrust. Well, first of all, talk about the thrust towards integrating New Orleans politics and, to a certain extent, New Orleans society and boards and commissions and organizations. I mean, he was pushing pretty hard on that. Was that
well? And I think,
working?
I think he should have, in the sense that I think he's a man of his word, and I think that's what he told him he would do, and I think that's what he was committed to doing. The thing I didn't understand exactly was why Moon would have put himself in the awkward position he did in letting Leon Irwin take him to those balls when they went backstage at that Momus ball. That was a very bad thing.
Explain that. I mean,
well,
there's a famous painting
George Schmidt
that George Schmidt did of Moon at Momus that depicts.
Well, I mean, it was just a bad thing, and Leon should not have done it, and he should have known that people would be drunk, and that a lot of people didn't like Moon, and that the people there didn't vote for him. And he brings Moon backstage to meet the king and have a drink with the king. And
this is the Momus Rex.
No, it's Momus Louisiana Club.
Okay. And it's everybody is in formal attire.
Not backstage, they weren't.
Oh, well, they were in a dressing room. And Leon was Moon's social advisor.
Yeah, taking him around, introducing him, and Moon was not comfortable at home in a situation like that, and I would never have subjected him to that. If he had suggested it himself, I'd have said, I wish you'd think about this, because these guys, when they get to drinking and all, they're not very gentlemanly, and I just don't want to see you exposed to that kind of thing.
And what happened?
Well, there was a spat. I wasn't there. Someone called him a name or something like that.
Yeah. So was he taking the city in the right direction on those issues?
I think he was taking the city in the only direction it could be taken in. I think, I don't believe, unless you're Julius Caesar or Napoleon, that you take people where they don't want to go. I think that the smart politician is the one that takes the people either where they want to go or where they're going, no matter what. And in Moon's case, I think it was no matter what. I think he knew the writing on the wall, and I think he was committed to getting it done. And that's all there was to it.
And we're talking about increased minority employment at City Hall, getting African Americans on boards and commissions, securing invitations to Mardi Gras balls somewhere down the road.
Well, I don't think Moon did that. Now, tokenism is another question that I have some real reservations about. I know that terrible about names now. Our good friend, the president of Xavier,
Norman Francis.
He would be a token black invited to certain balls and so forth. With me, I don't want to go where I'm not really wanted in order to make a point. And I hate the thought of using Norman that way. But he and then maybe Revius Ortiz would do the same thing. I don't know. But I think that Moon was the perfect transitional mayor. I think that I can't think of anyone else that could have handled the transition. And you know, they used to refer to him as our first black mayor, that sort of thing. But even if I disagreed with him, I thought he was doing maybe the wrong thing for the right reason, but it may have been the right thing for the right reason. I don't know. I can't fault him for it.
The other political campaign you were involved in directly in the early 1970s was running for the United States Senate in 1972. Why were you doing that? I mean, what impact on you and on the city had you noticed in the mayor's race? What did that accomplish for you? And then why did you get into another very visible race?
Well, I got into another one because Ellen Ellenwood had dropped dead suddenly. I mean, no one had counted on that. And
he was going to be on the ballot in November of 72, and he died in the summer of 72.
And the only one that had qualified against him was Bennett Johnston. Bennett had just lost a close race to Edwin Edwards, and no one else would jump in. And then Ellen had died, and I was still unhappy with my work, with what I was doing. I was bored, and I think I would have made a damn good senator too. But I didn't ever think I would get elected. And then John McKithen jumped in. He got in as an independent, and then Hall Lyons, Mr. Charlton Lyons, his son, got in as a whatever the right-wing party was called at the time. And so I had like 6 weeks to run, and the Republicans tried to keep me out. Dave Train tried to keep me out because the Republican Party belonged to Dave Train, and what support there was support for Dave. And Dave was running for Congress, and he didn't want any competitive races by other Republicans. And so I had a hard time even getting the Republicans to let me run. And in 6 weeks, you can't go to 64 parishes. And it was a lark, and nothing more. With 4 people in the race, and Bennett, well.
So what did you learn from that experience? You didn't run for public office again.
I learned that everything is political. Everything.
Then what did you do next in New Orleans? The Landrieu administration is charging along.
I wonder what I did do. I guess I collected books and read books, and I will say this, Jack. I had a pretty good following in New Orleans of just regular folks, and I did derive a certain joy or pleasure from recognition. And if I'd get in a cab, the cab driver would say, "Where do you want to go, Mr. Toledano?" I have to admit that my ego, or whatever the heck it is, was comforted by that. But I liked it because I guess that was the element of the family making a return to some degree of prominence. I think that's where that element came in, among the many elements involved. In a way, I was saying, well, we're coming back, but...
Well, you were also, as I recall from then, you were also very active as a preservationist.
I was
You were restoring buildings in neighborhoods that other people hadn't ventured into yet.
And I don't even remember when Charlie Ferguson had me write that weekly book review column for the States Item. But I did that for 50 weeks or so. That was fun. Really liked that. And
you started, or at least owned, an Italian restaurant on Magazine Street.
well, I had an interest in it. Dick Collin got Joe Bernstein to try to save Tercy's.
Yeah, Richard Collin being the
The Underground Gourmet.
and the restaurant critic for the States.
Right. And he told Joe he'd give him so many stars if he saved the restaurant.
I didn't know that he traded that way.
And then he became a consultant to the restaurant. And then Joe, I believe, terminated his consultation. And the restaurant lost a lot of stars in the process. But I mean, that was a beautiful building, though. I mean, we did a good job with that building.
So you restored the building, moved the
It
restaurant.
had original posters from the 1890s and French posters all over the walls. It was really great.
And it was on a stretch of Magazine Street that hadn't yet become
Right,
popular and expensive.
right.
Well, so
And we ended up buying the whole block. And then Joe opened Spaghetti Eddie's to go in competition with Tercy's. And it was right around the corner. You could walk in the backyard of Spaghetti Eddie's to get to Tercy's. And Bill Carpenter at the Whitney Bank said, "What is with Joe?" Said, "He's competing with his own restaurant." I said, "Yeah, Bill, I'm not sure I can explain it to you," but, and I couldn't.
well, now the restaurant phenomenon in New Orleans and Richard Collin were, I mean, if you were talking about the cultural themes of the 1970s. Let's take a little break.
Sorry.
Or have a leg stretch.
I can stand up. It's good.
So talking about Tercy's and Rose Tercy and you and Joe Bernstein in partnership to bring Tercy's to Magazine Street from Poydras with the support of Richard Collin. You were in the middle of, you got yourself in the middle of what a lot of people think of as one of the main themes of New Orleans cultural rebirth in the 1970s. The rediscovery of food that had been there all along, or the recombination of food that hadn't been there, like the blackened redfish. But Richard Collin, writing for the States Item, was a factor. Was this important in New Orleans life? This new fascination with food?
Well, I wasn't fascinated with it. Number one, I didn't put up any money except to buy the building.
Right.
And number two, all I did was decorate it, redo the building inside, design it, and decorate it. And so I wasn't really. Joe brought Toni Morrison in on the deal, sort of gave Toni a part of it. We never made $1, not $1 out of the whole thing. So I mean, it was an unusual situation.
Toni being the son of former mayor
Delaceps S. Morrison,
Shep Morrison,
the junior or whatever the heck he was, poor guy.
Well, what was it about the restaurant scene in New Orleans that made Joe Bernstein think that it was a viable investment?
I don't know, probably because Dick Collin talked to him about it. And said, only you can do it, Joe.
How influential was Dick Collin? I mean, we hadn't had a restaurant critic before approximately 1970, 71. And he started his doing his underground gourmet thing in the States Item every week. Was that a factor?
It wasn't to me.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't to me. I was. Joe and I had bought the building because it was my favorite building in that Magazine Street area. Just a beautiful building. We didn't know what we were going to do with it. We bought it for practically nothing. And then he decided that he was going to put a restaurant in there. And he borrowed all the money from the Whitney Bank. And so, what the heck, you know. That was that. But...
well, was food... I'm going to try this another way. Was food a factor in this New Orleans resurgence as a place that other people were paying attention to?
Well, it wasn't a factor to me. I was never...
You already knew where to eat.
Yeah, I was never a gourmet type person. But obviously, the future of New Orleans would become more and more dependent on tourist attractions, restaurants, bars, pageants, extravaganzas, so forth. And I think we were just early. We were just very early. I mean, nothing else had really begun on Magazine when we did our thing that I'm aware of. But
and yet, also on a parallel track was music and
music.
Yeah, but if there was a rediscovery of old New Orleans food and in introducing New Orleans food into that, there was also a rediscovery of old New Orleans music and combining it with other forms. And well,
you feel more about that than I do because
the Jazz Fest started 1970.
Yeah, and I was on the original board.
You were?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy that set it up and put me on the board. It wasn't Wayne. It was another fellow who had been with Radio Free Europe or something. I don't know. And I didn't even go to the darn thing. I mean, I hate that sort of stuff. I hate crowds. Anything over 8 people, and I'm miserable. But I was on the board.
How long did you stay on that board?
I don't know, 2 years maybe.
And what direction did they set? Do you recall?
No, and I didn't care. I hate that sort of stuff.
But the new attention to music was, along with the new attention to food, was that driving this cultural thrust that you're talking about?
I don't know. You call it music. I don't know what you're talking about exactly. I mean, if it's... the only thing I would call music would be Dixieland. Mm-hmm. The rest of the stuff, I don't much... I was never a pop person.
Well, there were people at that time who thought that the rediscovery of New Orleans rock and roll and rhythm and blues and Cajun music and the new Zydeco music and all of these things were were cultural treasures that needed to be showcased, and the Jazz Fest tried to do that.
Well, I think that anything that had that was a financial opportunity was looked on that way. And I think music was, I don't know anything about that kind of music. I don't pretend to. And I think that a lot of people took an interest in it. It wasn't something that interested me.
And as we're experiencing the real estate boom on Poydras Street, we're seeing some people paying attention to music and food in New Orleans. Were those two things, was the cultural fascination masking the economic weakness of the city? In other words, you said earlier that the oil industry wasn't really as firmly rooted here as it needed to be. The port was not as well run as it needed to be. And you've alluded to the tourism economy. Is this where we made the transition to the tourism economy?
Well, I can't go any further than to say that I think that Moon recognized that tourism was ultimately going to become our primary industry. That New Orleans had always been a good time town since before the Civil War, long before. Planters had come to New Orleans to kick up their heels and see the girls and drink and gamble and so forth, and that was its image, and that it was going to have to rely more and more on that. So I think that he very actively supported the city in that direction. But from what I know, what little I know, I have no personal knowledge about it. It's surprising sometimes how insular many of us were. I am probably the only person I know who's been to all 64 parishes. And I would say that most New Orleanians have never been north of Covington, or maybe Baton Rouge if they had to go to Baton Rouge.
In Louisiana.
In Louisiana. Yeah. They'll go to Alaska, but they don't know where Bunkie is. And maybe it's okay, but we were very insular, and I don't think that's ever been adequately captured, the insularity of uptown New Orleans. Now people are celebrating the fact that real estate is so sought after and so high in uptown New Orleans. But the fact is that the community itself is getting smaller and more compact, more isolated. I mean, you can draw the lines as to where it actually fits in. You found out when you were trying to save all those houses and from the hospital or whatever.
After Katrina.
Yeah. But they're satisfied, and when people are satisfied or think they are, they won't leave things alone. It's never been a place where there was a great effort made to improve or change things. It just hasn't. It hasn't been its record, its character.
Let's talk about the Superdome. And this was an idea that germinated in the mid-1960s. Governor McKiffen made the money available. Dave Dixon did a sales job. Moon Landrieu was probably working as the main driver to actually implement it and design it and build it. And there was a lot of controversy about the Superdome, whether it should be built, where it should be built. What did it look like to you from that mid-1970s vantage point? A good idea or not?
Well, I wasn't involved in it, and
In your capacity as observer.
well, I didn't think that they could legally do it with public money. I didn't think they could legally do it with public money. That was my lawyer's position on the matter. Because the state could not pledge its full faith and credit to finance the building of the dome. And the boys came up with an idea. And that's the way it turned out.
They got it done. Now, what about its urban design implications? It's downtown. Is
I
that
didn't,
good or bad? Did it help over the long haul?
I think it probably helped. And I was very fond of Buster Curtis, who did the design. You remember the firm of Devious and Courteous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Previously known as Curtis and Davis.
Yeah.
Well, Buster Curtis was the architect. Has
Right.
that, did it strike you at the time as being acceptable in the New Orleans skyline?
Well, it ruined the view of the church. It ruined our train station, I guess, and our bus station, which were pretty much eliminated. That neighborhood generally was pretty run down up to Jackson Avenue. I must say I don't remember much that was torn down that was noteworthy in order to buy it. It was not something in which I was interested, frankly. I thought that Tulane Stadium was one of the best football stadiums I ever saw. So that's why the boys had to get rid of it.
And make Tulane play in the Superdome?
Well, yeah, and the Freemans owned a lot of the land and the hotel and
In front of the Superdome?
yeah.
And a couple of people you mentioned earlier, Don Hubbard and Sherman Copeland, were contractors for the Superdome. They had a company called Superdome Services.
Right.
And they were handling all the setup and
Janitorial
janitorial work.
Yeah.
Now, was that something that had to be done?
Not by them. It could have been done by people who had experience and, they got it for political reasons. Anything that those two touched, you could bet your life it was a boondoggle, let's put it that way.
And yet they had been key people in the Seoul political organization.
Absolutely.
As you said earlier, they were solidly behind Moon Landrieu.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't think Moon would deny that he treated his friends generously with any opportunity that he felt was proper. I mean, I don't think he would deny that. I hate to think of him having to deal with the Hubbards and the Copelands, but
You hate to think
of Moon having to deal with people like that. But
you mean you
he did
sympathize with him on that?
Oh, absolutely. It was just part of what makes that job so nasty and so difficult, particularly for him in the sense that he was the transitional figure. And things were going to change very radically during the 8 years that Moon was mayor. And they could not have been more difficult years than they were for him.
But he did have a strong economy in most of those years. It started tapering off After
He may
was-
have. I don't know. I never did pay attention to that sort of stuff.
And he put together a staff that some people called a Camelot. He had smart people working for him. Did you interact with any of them?
Well, I know I knew Blake Orata and think highly of him. And I don't know who the others were really. Ben Levy, I guess he was an able fellow. But I didn't really have much contact with them.
And and his staff and the mayor then set up the Historic District Landmarks Commission apparatus that's still in place in New Orleans.
That's a wonderful thing.
Did that meet with your approval then? Support?
No, because I didn't know about it. I mean,
Well, you were the preservationist.
I know, but Camille would have known about it. Camille Strong, but I wouldn't have, because I never knew about things like that.
But this met with your approval.
I'm sure it would have if I'd known about it.
And tell me about then the other thing they had to wrestle with was this influx of federal money that increased dramatically from the late 60s into the early 70s. Model cities and others. Did that work the way it was supposed to in New Orleans?
Well, I think it did for Sherman and Hubbard and the boys. I think it worked beautifully for them. I don't know.
In the sense that what?
I think they got rich out of it. I think they shared in the pie. I've never talked to Moon about how much control he actually, when I wrote my article for commentary, I assumed that Moon had really been forced to give up certain control, complete control. He's a control guy, and he's a very decisive guy, and I don't know what he had to do with these guys. I don't know what agreements they had to make. I just know that they were doing very well.
But to use that money, you had to set up a brand new apparatus in city governments around the country. Do you think the money got, at least in large part, where it was supposed to go?
I have no idea.
Yeah. Was it a problem at the time?
I don't know.
Another thing that was going on with the sort of expanding city was New Orleans East, and the city had been.
No, that should not have happened.
Yeah.
That should never have happened.
Why? New Orleans
because it was too damn low. For one thing, it was marshland, and it should have been preserved for what it was. Should have been left alone. But we went through a period there where everybody I knew was building those damn paper apartment houses out there along the interstate and turning them, and it was dreadful. And I mean, I hated to think of people living in those places, and they were ugly, and it just ruined that part to me of New Orleans. And remember how that shopping center was so fabulous out there. Everybody loved it.
Lake Forest Plaza.
Whatever it was big, and it was pretty plush initially when it was open. Now it's a dead zone. And I don't mean just because of Katrina. I mean, it was dead before Katrina.
Yeah. This was a response to white flight to Jefferson Parish, wasn't it? We have a place where we can build a suburb within our city boundaries, and we can have a shopping center to collect tax revenue.
I don't think whites moved there. I don't know the numbers, but I would be very surprised if many white families moved there. Many black families did, but the white families that moved into Jefferson Parish, and converted that into a sort of a Plaquemine St. Bernard. But New Orleans East was just dreadful to me.
Could it have been prevented? We had a city that was, in 1960, 600,000 people and very compact on the high ground.
Okay.
And by the time we got 20 years further down the road, we had a much smaller population, and it was spread out into places like New Orleans.
Yeah, it could have been completely prevented.
So how?
Zoning. Zoning is, I mean, all they had to do was zone it marshland. It was unfit. They had to dig in those canals, cut those canals, just to try to keep the land dry. It was simply not meant to be a residential housing area. Of course it could have been prevented, but there were too many boys that were building them and turning them and making money, and it was...
Who was driving that? Was it just
can't...
real estate interests? Or was it political interests?
A lot of bankers were doing it. I don't know who else, but the ones I knew were bankers. They'd get Bank A to lend to Banker B and build and then move it. And it was like a checker game. It was very bad, I thought.
And if New Orleans hadn't created New Orleans East, and where would that thrust go? Would it have gone to other parishes, or would it have stayed in New Orleans?
I think it would have been in the, what do you all call it, the Treme now, in that area? I mean, the Gentilly, when you come in at Gentilly, let's take Walker's Movie House.
Come in from the east?
Yeah. That whole area down to the quarter could have been done over into a nice residential area. Right on top of St. Bernard.
Mm-hmm. And that would have been for...
Ninth Ward.
And a lot of the people who, as you said, moved to New Orleans East were black residents of New Orleans.
First homeowners.
And this could have been for them, this Gentilly 9th Ward, 7th Ward area?
It could have been, but it could have been a nice integrated neighborhood, too, of homeowners. I think that, I don't know that I've ever seen it, but I think that if you had an area where the buildings were done over, restored, and made neat and clean and nice, that there would be a good chance that home ownership by both blacks and whites could work. Not rental property, but because the rental property racket, the way people let their homes just rot away and get those rents, just incredible. I remember an acquaintance of mine used to collect his own rents every Saturday. He was a lawyer in New Orleans, Leonard Rosenson. And one Saturday, this fella pulled a gun on him and told him to get under the house and throw his trousers out and his sack with his rental money. And so Leonard didn't stop collecting the rent after that, but he hired an off-duty policeman to go with him to collect the rent every Saturday. Armed.
What neighborhood?
Down in that same area, the Treme, I guess.
One of the beliefs in New Orleans is that the move of a lot of black residents to New Orleans East was because their own traditional neighborhoods, at least some of them, were hurt by the construction of Interstate 10 along Claiborne Avenue and through the 7th Ward and Treme. Did you in the late 1960s, did you have any apprehensions about the construction of Interstate 10 in that neighborhood?
Jack, I swear I don't remember. The only thing I remember getting it at all involved in was that Riverfront Expressway.
Which was about the same time in a slightly different location. Were you involved in the Riverfront Expressway?
Not really, except that friends of mine were, Mrs. Robinson and Bill Bora in particular, Dick Baumbach, and that's where I got my information. I didn't know anything beyond that. But I don't think that New Orleans East was a proper place to develop, and I don't think it was the only place that black families could have gone to build a strong neighborhood. When you come in on the interstate into New Orleans
from the east,
and you look both ways and you see the wonderful churches and buildings and that whole area around the Circle Market and over, that could be a vibrant neighborhood, but there again, you need the leadership, and New Orleans has always been short on that.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It's when people are asked, people in leadership positions are asked about Interstate 10 over Claiborne Avenue. Not very many, if any, will say that they thought it was a mistake, but almost universally, they will say it would have been a terrible mistake to build the Riverfront Expressway in front of the French Quarter. Both projects were parallel at the time, and one happened and one didn't.
I think they were both bad, and I think that the reason they were able to get away with the Claiborne situation is because poor people lived there, and a lot of blacks did. And that was a wonderful boulevard there, I thought. I mean, as a child, we used to drive on that and go to restaurants or to show people little St. Roch's Chapel and all of that sort of stuff. But there again, it was, we're not going to be able to get any organized opposition, so therefore let's put it here and ruin it and just, just, that's the kind of neglect of people for racial reasons that I resent bitterly. I mean, I think too much of most black people to want them to have to join the Boston Club, but at the same time, I would like to protect something like Claiborne Avenue from that horrendous overpass that's on it there. And that market there was one of the most wonderful places. I remember as a little boy going there, and it was so nice. I hear they're going to fix it up.
Construction is underway right now on that. But in the kind of black political power that was growing in the 60s, that was reflected in the results of the 1970 mayor's race, was probably necessarily, do you agree with this, probably necessarily concerned with things like voting rights and political and the right to vote. And so if this plan for a expressway going through your neighborhood comes in 1965 or so, you're concentrating more on your political rights than on your neighborhood quality of life.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I don't think that they were near so interested in the voting rights and serving in public office and as they were in money. I think it's the same old game, money. And I don't think they cared because they didn't live any longer off of Claiborne Avenue. They lived in fancier houses in other areas, and it didn't affect them, and they didn't furnish the leadership. That's the question that the minute a white person asks a question like that, he gets called a racist. He says, someone says, where are the people who are leading the charge for good public education, for proper attire, for proper behavior, for so many other things, for decent neighborhoods, clean neighborhoods? Well, you're a racist. And you say, well, wait a minute. On one hand, I'm told it's none of my business because I'm white, and it's up to the blacks to take care of their own lives and fortunes. But at the same time, if they do nothing about it, then the poor blacks are the ones that suffer. And everyone's just taking the easy way out now. They say, why fight the system? I mean, whoever thought you'd have political correctness? Whoever thought that freedom of speech would be second to political correctness? And this is what we're going through. I don't know how we're going to pull ourselves out of this one. So often a movement will, sort of like the Reformation, I guess, it'll go further than it was supposed to go, and it can't be stopped. You don't know what to do about it. So wait, we didn't want to go this far. Said, man, it's out of my hands. This thing is rolling.
And this far is where? What do you mean by this far?
Well, I mean that I don't think it was ever intended that the conditions for blacks in many respects should get worse than they were before, like the quality of public education, which to me is the most important thing. But when the Jeffersons come in and the other crooks, and they see the money to be made, they will destroy an education system in order to benefit from it. And when you want to, and health care, same thing. Remember there was that hospital thing that Sherman Copeland was involved in. He had a traveling trailers or something with x-ray machines or whatever, but
was that the Family Health Foundation?
I guess so. And remember, he spilled the beans on Joe Beasley, and poor Joe went to jail, and
Joe
Sherman
Beasley being
didn't.
the doctor who ran it.
And Jerry Gallinghouse told me,
United States Attorney,
yes, that he was out of town, and when he got back, Jimmy Carrier, who was an assistant U.S. attorney, told him, I made a deal with Sherman Copeland and granted him immunity if he would spill the beans on Joe Beasley. And Jerry blew up. He was furious about it, that Jimmy would do that without consulting Jerry. And that's the way it ended up.
I guess the deal stuck, yeah. Now, Family Health was something that was providing services to poor people.
Maybe.
Some. Back to the New Orleans politics in the 1970s. If Moon Landrieu was, in effect, the first black mayor, the first actual black mayor, in his description, was Dutch Morial. What changed when Mayor Morial took over in 1978 from when Moon had been doing it the previous 8 years?
Well, I'd say an awful lot changed. One, basically the white community had no real contact with City Hall after that. There were a few lowlifes like the guy in the steel business, whatever his name was. You remember that fella? Glazer? But
who was an ally of Dutch Morial.
Of Dutch Morial, yeah. But I think that's when the die was cast, and people believe there'll never be another white mayor. And there wouldn't have been if Nagin hadn't been Nagin. But it looked like there it was, that Moon had been the transitional figure. Dutch was a mean SOB. He was a get-even guy. I mean, he would hurt you. If you had ever turned against him or said anything about him, like, I know how he felt about me after he tried to convert to a Republican, and I told that story.
He tried to become a Republican. Can you tell that story?
He called me and he said, "Can we have breakfast at the Pavillon?" Meekum owned it at the time. And I said, "Sure." So he and I went there. I remember Joe DeRosa and that fellow in the furniture business, Mintz, was sitting at another table. And Dutch said to me, he said, "I've been thinking about running," he was an appellate court judge. He said, "I've been thinking of running for mayor as a Republican if you people can raise the money for me to run a real campaign. And I wanted to see what you thought of it." And I said, "Dutch," I said, "it would be great for the Republicans to be able to say, well, look, we're not anti-black, we're supporting Dutch Morial." I said, "But I think that it would be terrible for you because you're not a popular guy, and there are a lot of black people who will vote for you as a Democrat who would not vote for you as a Republican, because they'd have an excuse then. They wouldn't have to say, I don't like Dutch. They could say, I don't vote Republican." And I said, "I just don't think it would work for you." And he said, "Well, I wanted to talk to you and Jimmy Galata, Judge Galata, about it, see what you thought." And here I was talking him out of it, trying to be fair. Well,
Trying to save him from making a mistake?
yeah, which I did, because then he ran as a Democrat and won. And I told that story on radio once, I think, and he vowed to get even with me someday. And I know that when I was under consideration for that Court of Appeals judgeship, he went all out against me.
That was when President Reagan was considering nominating you for the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal.
And Dutch.
And Dutch was still mayor then.
Dutch and John Wisdom were the two that were the key to knocking me off. The old racist business. But to show you how mean Dutch was, I tell you this story. After Dr. King was killed, I wanted to do something that would help the community. And I said to a couple of my friends, John Pettibone, Bo Redmond, a couple others, I said, now's the time for us to try to do something constructive so that some good can come out of this tragedy. So I called Dr. Albert Dent, who was the president of Dillard University. And I said, "Dr. Dent, would it be possible for a couple of us to come out there and visit with you?" And he said, "Sure, Ben, come on out." And we went out there to his home on campus. And I told him, I said, "This is a terrible, terrible thing. But what I was hoping was that we could put together a group, half blacks, half whites, that would meet regularly, talk about city problems, possible solutions, and get young people from both sides to work together. And Dr. Dent said, this is a happy moment for me. He said, I never thought that any good would come out of this. Terrible loss, but perhaps it can. So he said, let me work on it from my end. He said, I'm going to get in touch with Ernest Morial and a couple other guys and see if we can set this thing up, and I'll get back to you. So a couple of weeks passed, and I didn't hear from Dr. Dent. So I called him, and I said, Dr. Dent, I know you're busy, and I'm sorry to bother you, but I was just wondering if you had had any luck. And he said, Ben, he said, I've been too embarrassed to call you. He said, right after I met with you, I met with Dutch Morial, and I told him of your idea. And Morial and I had never had any problems at that time. And he said, and he told me, we're not going to let those white bastards off the hook. They're not going to be able to do anything that's going to absolve them of responsibility for what happened. And we are going to use that event to further our cause. And Dr. Dent said, I'm just heartbroken that this thing didn't work out. And I'm very sorry. I hope you'll understand. And I said, yes, sir, I will. So there was that, which tells me about Dutch's resentment, you know, which he had so deeply because of the color thing, because of his father's color, and his, you know, his father didn't know him on the bus when Dutch.
Explain that.
Well, Dutch's father was lighter than he was, much lighter, and could pass for white. So Dutch used to get on the bus and sit in the back, and he was a good bit darker than his father, and he'd pass his father up, and his father wouldn't even recognize him. I mean, would not act like he knew him, even saw him, and that always hurt Dutch's feelings.
Where does that story come from?
From Dutch. But I don't know where all the stories appeared. But
so as mayor, did he continue the progress New Orleans was making towards being less segregated?
I don't think so, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not able to evaluate that. I had the feeling that Dutch wanted the confrontation, wanted the friction between the races because it strengthened his position. He could say, I told you the way it was. I don't think that he was as good for the black community as Moon was. I think Moon did a lot more. And Dutch was a snob, too. You know, he was of that very, very light strain of a colored person. And he didn't think of himself as a brother to the really black people. He sort of saw himself as the overseer rather than one of the boys. But I think Moon was much better for the black community.
Moon Landrieu wouldn't say anything detrimental about, doesn't say anything detrimental about Dutch Morial, but I've heard from other people that there was considerable friction at the transition between the Landrieu administration and the Morial administration, and that there was not an effort to try to build on any accomplishments or all of the accomplishments of the Landrieu administration.
Well, of course, I wouldn't know anything about that, but I would expect that that's true, and I don't think Moon liked Dutch, and vice versa. And but Moon is rising above the fray. You know, he doesn't want to speak ill of people. He's a senior elder statesman, and there's nothing in it, no advantage to him to speak ill of these people. But I don't think there was a closeness there.
Could you think of what accomplishment there was in the 8 years of the Dutch Morial administration? I mean, it took us out of the 1970s, and then by the time he left office, New Orleans was pretty clearly in decline. I'm not saying that was his responsibility, but it was a different experience.
Well, I think it was his responsibility, Jack, in a sense. I think that it's the job of the mayor or the top guy, whoever he is, to bring people together to work for a common cause. Dutch was the worst person you could have gotten to bring people together. He couldn't even work with anybody himself. I mean, at a time when we desperately needed to work together, I really believe that he saw his advantage in maintaining the tension between the races. Mm-hmm. I don't think Dutch ever set out to save New Orleans, so to speak, to call people in and say, listen, you get to work on this and I want some results soon, or anything like that. I think that he worked in a different way.
Can you describe that way again?
Well, he was very brusque and abrupt, and he would shake his finger at you. And when I'd be in his office, he had a clipping that Iris Kelso had written where I had been critical of him. And he'd open his drawer and he'd pull it out. And he'd say, you see this? You see this article? You said these things. And I would say...
What did you say?
I don't know. Probably that he didn't get along with people or something.
And go ahead.
And I'd just say, yeah, I said that. It's true. And he didn't have much sense of humor, but he...
What were you doing in his office?
Well, I'd have to go there occasionally to talk about something that was... I don't even know what it was. Yeah, I knew him fairly well.
Can you give me 1 minute? I need to replace the chip in this.
Okay, we'll take a pause.
Some serious questions.
Some real questions.
Well, I don't know about how serious this will be, but you had painted a picture of uptown New Orleans society culture as a sort of endogamous, insulated world. That the only way you could get into it would be to marry a debutante. And I think other people have commented to be that way, but when things started changing in the city, I mean, there were also a lot of really smart people in that world. Inside that world, was there disagreement about the proper route to take for the city? Or was it, as you said, it takes just a few people to blackball a member? Did it take a few people to derail what otherwise might have been people with good ideas?
Well, a couple of things, Justin. One, I think that the makeup of the uptown, so-called uptown society, has changed in recent years or decades, in the sense that it's not pure like they thought it was at one time. People come in now and become a part of it by, say, joining the lawn tennis club or there are various and sundry ways in which you could going hunting or fishing with this guy or that guy and that sort of thing. So I think that, number one, the numbers, there's been an attrition of the old timers, and they need people to fill the slots so that lawyers who are, just first generation white collar or country doctors can come in and be a part of this. So I think that's changed. The other part, let's see, how would you rephrase your other question?
Well, particularly in the 1960s,
Yeah.
were there younger members who maybe, like yourself, were in some ways born to this world that felt like things needed to change? They understood that things needed to change, but they're either the elders or some of their cohort. Was there disagreement in your generation in this world?
Well, there were several of us that felt that way, but we really didn't have a voice. The way things worked, in other words, if Mr. Fenner or Mr. Freeman or Mr. Kelleher wanted something done, or Bud McCall, they would work behind the scenes, was what they called it, to get it done. We would have been considered very pushy if we had tried to tell them what to do, because we would have looked on them as our superiors, and I didn't know a lot of these bright people that you referred to, other than the Jewish community, which is practically non-existent now in uptown New Orleans, which was a major factor at one time, not only in commerce, but in uptown New Orleans. I mean, they were very prominent. And before World War I, they were not discriminated against socially in New Orleans.
So,
They belonged
and what
there.
happened to the Jewish community to have its numbers so diminished now?
Well, I think that
Numbers and influence.
I think that they decided a long time ago that New Orleans was over. I think the smart ones, I'd tell you off the record what we always said, but because I don't think we should record it, but that explained what.
No pause.
You want to take a pause?
These cameras have.
Look at the river, Baton Rouge North. Clinton and Natchez and Vicksburg. Those were very, very vibrant Jewish communities there. Beautiful synagogues. Now, not a Jew to be found, because they knew that the commerce wasn't going to be there anymore. They went where there would be business. A lot of them went to California or Montana or out west somewhere. And, you saw the Stern family pull up roots in New Orleans and leave. And they know when Canal Street was the most wonderful street probably in America at one time. One great store after another. I mean, it was unbelievable. Adler's next to Hausman's, Gaucho's, Meyer's Real, Gus Meyer, on and on and on. All gone. That's not just shopping centers. That's a lot of reasons. And they're not here anymore. And
what's the succinct explanation for that?
Because of the drying up of commerce. Who stayed? Goldring and Woldenberg. Why? Because they sold booze. Now, what does that tell you? They didn't sell clothes. They sold booze.
So the shrinkage of New Orleans as a market retail market.
Oh, gone. And it was top of the line. I'd say Terry and Juden was as fine a men's store, or a small store, as I ever went into. They made clothing there and everything. Look at Haspel, it's gone. I mean, Haspel was New Orleans. But all of them are gone. Their kids go away to college and they never come back. That's all there's to it. Look at my 4 kids. They go away to college. They live everywhere but in the South.
You actually answered the follow-up question. Where did they go? Where did the...
Well, I know where mine go. San Francisco, Connecticut, Brooklyn Hospital, Middleburg, Virginia. You know, the horse vets in Virginia.
And they went to New Orleans high schools.
They went to Newman School, which is quite different from just a New Orleans high school.
Right. And they went to colleges where? At Stanford and Harvard.
And Chapel Hill.
Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
Wake Forest.
Virginia Tech. I didn't know that. I told you that Virginia Tech was the vet school for Maryland and Virginia. I didn't realize it covered the 2 states.
Yeah, I used to take my daughter. I taught at Virginia Tech for 2 years. Yeah.
Well, my daughter, after she finished at Chapel Hill, she went there to get her doctor of veterinary medicine. She's a horse doctor in Middleburg, Virginia now. But
well, now, people are saying that New Orleans post-Katrina is affording young people more opportunities.
I hear that.
Do you think if your smart kids had this choice of where to live in a later decade, like now, they'd find something to do in New Orleans?
No.
And that is why?
Because I don't think there are any opportunities there. What are you going to be, a lawyer? I told my 4 children I wouldn't contribute a nickel to any one of them becoming a lawyer. That was the one thing I wouldn't do because of my feelings about being a lawyer. But what are they going to do? I mean, everyone doesn't own Leidenheimer Bakery like Sandy Wan. That's making my son's best friend. If you have a family business, or Boat and O'Reilly's business, you know, Riley Coffee Company. I mean, there are not that many businesses. French bread, coffee, Zatarans, you know, food preparation, seasonings, spices. Everything is pretty much directed toward food, tourism, that sort of thing.
Now,
what would they do?
I was gonna say, what would you say? What were the biggest missed opportunities in the 1970s?
Well, I think by then the die may have been somewhat cast. As far the opportunity was the oil and gas industry. Now it would trickle back and forth from time to time. I'm not qualified. It would take an oil man to tell you when it was that the big companies had sizable offices in New Orleans, when they decided to consolidate in Houston and so forth. I don't know. But oil and gas, that's where the oil and gas was. I mean, my goodness, what better place than right near the mouth of the river, South Louisiana. And we couldn't even keep the industry here. I mean, there. Whenever that was lost, I'm not good on dates because I just think in terms of happenings. But once we lost that, now the port thing was different because containers and bulk cargoes made a big difference. As general cargo decreased because of the containers, you didn't need the stevedores and the longshoremen. When I ran for mayor, the two most powerful political organizations in New Orleans were the black and the white longshoremen's unions. Chink Henry ran the black union, and Lindsey Williams ran the white union. And they were powerful because I walked the whole riverfront in every warehouse shaking hands with the people who worked there. And, of course, there was nothing you could do about the cargo other than what you could do with containers. I mean, but then bulk cargo, you'd bring it down in barges, your beans and your corn. You'd pump it out of the hold of the barge into a silo. A ship would come from Europe or wherever, down South Louisiana. They'd just, like a vacuum cleaner, suck the beans out, put them in the hold of the ship, and that was it. And it was not labor intensive at all. There were no jobs there, so that really hurt. The port was not something we could have done much about other than increasing trade, with Central America. But
I guess we should point out that you know something about the bulk grain trade, since you spent some years as involved in one of the big grain elevators in Plaquemines Parish, the Mississippi River Grain Elevator.
Yeah, my client.
So you know how it works.
I know a little bit about it, not much, but a little bit.
What was it like? What did the longshoremen say to you when you walked down the dock in 1970? I mean, were they supportive of you?
Yeah,
especially
the
with
white ones were.
Yeah.
I'd say almost to a man. Yeah, they knew who I was. And they were, yeah. No, they were very friendly. And the black guys were friendly too. I mean, I just don't know that. I don't seem to have had much black support, if the numbers are correct.
By the early 1980s, New Orleans was planning to have a World's Fair in 1984. And this was, I think, an initiative of the Morial administration, or am I wrong about that? It was supported. It was supported by City Hall. But at any rate, by the time we got to 1984, we had a world economy that wasn't particularly interested, and we had these drivers in New Orleans that you mentioned, the port and the oil industries in significant enough decline, and the real estate boom on Poydras Street had declined, that there wasn't a whole lot of interest in the World's Fair. Was that the end of the 1970s?
I don't know, Jack. I was no longer in New Orleans in 84. I left, I guess it was 83, early 83. But I do remember this, though. We had those beautiful streets with those granite cobblestones that had been there since the 18th century, the ballast stones that had been used. And they went in with Caterpillar equipment and just dug up all of these and loaded them on trucks to throw away. Well, I ran down a dump up near Bogalusa where they had dumped some of them, where this guy named Ronald Jefferson had dumped them. He had trucks that were picking them up and dumping. And I arranged to buy a truckload of those to line my gardens with, and they are so beautiful. I mean, the way they were carved, it's incredible. And they just plowed them up. These beautiful, beautiful streets. I mean, that's the kind of thing that hurts me a lot. But I don't know.
I remember reading a transcript of a talk you gave on the eve of the World's Fair, in which you were apprehensive about the coming tourism economy.
Right. And saying that it would, and saying that I thought the fair was going to be a flop, which it was, a dismal flop, as you know. I mean, the New Orleans people barely went down there.
Why did you leave? You had mentioned Ronald Reagan's appointment of you to, or considering appointing you to the Fifth Circuit.
I had been knocked off by then, but
that was in '82 or so.
Yeah. I left for a lot of reasons, many of which were not good reasons. I'm not particularly, proud of my attitude, but I was pretty bitter toward the city at the time, and wasn't thinking clearly, in the sense that I thought the only way that I could punish New Orleans was to leave. Now that shows you how disturbed I was to think that I could make any difference. But it was all I had. All I had was myself. And so I said, well, at least they won't have that. And that's basically why I left.
So this was about 1983, 82?
Yeah.
And you moved first to
Charlottesville.
And by the mid-'80s, your family was in Charlottesville. And,
Yeah.
Would you, if you hadn't left, do you think you should have stayed?
No. No, I think I had run my course.
And you live in Mississippi now, both in Pass Christian and in Columbus.
Yeah.
With Margot.
Right.
And do you ever go back to New
No.
Orleans?
No.
Why?
I just don't miss it. And there are a lot of people I wouldn't want to see. And I'm afraid it's a tough town not to run into everybody on the street, And there are a lot of people I wouldn't want to run into. I should have kept getting my PhD at LSU in history and should have been a teacher, but I didn't do that.
When did you make that decision?
When I ran out of money and got married.
That was...
Then I went to Macaulay School in Chattanooga and taught there for a year, prep school. And then I decided, hey, I'm going back to New Orleans and I'm going to do something there. That was in 61, something like that. And so I went back and didn't do anything.
Well,
so I was half right. I went back.
I'd say based on some of the things we've been talking about, you did a few things.
I never did anything that... I never entered a race that I could win. And I don't mean just politics. I mean just generally, every cause I've espoused has gone south, as they say. But
you think you didn't have impact on these issues as you were talking about? Okay. Well, we run into people who dispute that appraisal.
Well, don't believe them.
Justin, what else do we have to talk about?
I think this has been a strong interview.
Can I introduce? That was a nice ending, but I was thinking of a topic we hadn't talked about. Do you have another 5 minutes?
Sure.
I'll probably maybe insert this earlier in the interview. So, the media in New Orleans in the 1970s. You mentioned Charlie Ferguson.
Yeah.
How important was the States Item that Charlie Ferguson edited.
Very.
In making, in sort of creating an alternative voice. You wrote for it.
Very important. Charlie had a lot to do with electing Moon mayor.
In what way?
He went all out for him. Asked him if his cars didn't have moon stickers on them. And he, no, Charlie was a big moon supporter, a very strong moon supporter, which is fine. I think maybe sometimes it affected the journalism a little bit. But he was, I would say that Charlie was as good a supporter as Moon had.
And that was reflected on the editorial page and maybe a little in the news coverage, but the States Item news coverage was different from the Times-Picayune's. But there were we also had television stations that did some good reporting. You mentioned Iris Kelso. We had Rosemary James. We had alternative newspapers that were sort of hadn't existed in previous decades. Was New Orleans benefiting from having media diversity?
Was it then?
Yeah.
Well, I think a follow-up question would be, did it have any long-lasting effect? I think at the time, we were damn lucky to have Figaro and Vieux Carré Courier and the States Item. I think Charlie did a grand job there. But ask yourself, it may have delayed the inevitable a little bit, but did it make any real difference other than informing a few people who probably had an inkling already and just learned a little bit more
about
what was going on, what the problems were, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And the States Item, Charlie Ferguson, as editor, took over the Times-Picayune and was able to convert that into an improved newspaper.
Absolutely.
Was that in time to make a difference?
I don't think so. I think he did a wonderful job, but I don't think that the paper was going to. Number one, Ashton Phelps, I don't know this, but I would imagine that little Ashton and Charlie were never bosom buddies. And the Phelpses always exerted a tremendous influence there. And they were part of the let things alone, let them go their own way. But
okay.
No, I don't think so.
Just anything else we should be asking? Is there anything else? Anything that we should have asked you?
I love that question. We used to ask witnesses that in court.
That's where you got some of your best results?
Adverse witnesses, you'd say, is there anything else I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
Right.
And the guy would look at you like you were crazy. And the opposing counsel would jump up and say, Your Honor, if he doesn't know what questions to ask, I don't want my witness to tell him.
Okay, well then we'll call that the last question.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.